So the way we think about race now goes back to the middle of the 20th century at a particular historical juncture in light of the Nazis, at a moment when the United States needed solidarity, needed to pull in all people to get over the Great Depression and to fight the Second World War. So at that point, anthropologists said there are really only 3 human races. And they were ranked Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. And the oid tells you that they are scientific. So now we assume that there's one big white race, and it's on a toggle switch. Either you're in it or you're out. That was not the case. That was not earlier the case. So in the 19th century, a thinker like Ralph Waldo Emerson could very easily see that there were several white races. This was commonplace in science. There were several white races. The ones at the top were called Teutonic or Saxon or Anglo-Saxon. Ralph Waldo Emerson thought of himself as a Saxon. And then there were other white races, like the Celtic race. Because remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson lived at the time of heavy, impoverished immigration from Ireland. The Irish immigrants of Emerson's time were very poor, dirty, ignorant people. So therefore, they belonged to an inferior race. And then at the turn of the 20th century, there was the Eastern European Hebrew race. There was the Northern Italian race. There was the Southern Italian race. There were all these white races, many, 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 many white races. And then the non-whites were lumped into big categories like Chinese or Negro. So unless they were in special places like Louisiana, Negro or Chinese was not disaggregated. So poor Catholic Irishmen were definitely white. Poor Italian Neapolitan immigrants were definitely white. They just belonged to inferior white races. That was the thinking in the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. They were definitely white. They belonged to inferior white races, plural. Now, interestingly enough, this kind of thinking wasn't just in the United States. For instance, the racial thinkers in France often said, well, you know, there are 2 races in France, they said. The aristocrats belong to the Teutonic race, and the peasants belong to the Celtic race. It was respectable to say that and think like that in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So my book takes readers from European antiquity, before races, into the 19th and 20th centuries, many white races, then one big white race, right into the moment of its publication in 2010. A crucial turning point in the thinking about race is in the mid-20th century. I have told you about the mid-20th century remaking, simplifying the racial hierarchy into just 3 races with just one white or Caucasian race. Something else took place in the middle of the 20th century, which is absolutely crucial for what I want to say today.
Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. I just hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. Now, did you know that when looking at the history of white people, did you know that we had a lot of poor people with only few rich people. Majority of the white people working as peasants, working in industries, until during the Industrial Revolution, when now people were being divided according to class. Now, today with me, this is a presentation of an African American professor. I'll note down his name while we will be watching the video. She talks about the history of white people, and she talks about what does the history of white people teaches us about race. What can we learn? Actually, there are important things that we get to learn out of this video, because it explains essentially how they categorize white people and how they really think, and how the issue of race came about. Because you get to realize that we had a lot of poor white people who worked as peasants, with only few people who controlled factors of production. The few white people who controlled factors of production are these people who they were of the higher class, and majority of white people worked as peasants. So the African American professor she is going to explain the classes, the categories of these people, how they came to be, and why we are seeing the white supremacy, which is today. How did it just came out? How did it come out? Because even before we had black people and white people who worked in solidarity, who were both in the middle class, poor working white people and poor working black people. We had them, they were working together. Now you'll ask yourself, where did this classification came? When did the question of race started? How was the classification of white people? Do we just have white people? Do you want to know their down route, their history, and everything? So today, join me in today's presentation, and I'll be taking you through also alongside what she's saying, that I believe that it is important that we also need to look like. So when the small elite group started controlling factories and industries, the majority of the workers lived in poverty. And now that's when the classification of white people and black people started. So in the United States, whiteness was often used to create a sense of solidarity among poor and rich white people. Despite their class difference, this was done through policies that granted even the poor white people certain legal and social privileges over people of color. However, you need to know that the class existed. The class division still exists today with us, and the poor white people often suffer from economic exploitation by the wealthy. This explains as to why we are all seeing white people together with black people complaining about the living standards of things in the United States. Now, the most important history of whiteness and class, it's important, and even we people from the black community, this is something that we need to look into, because we get to see how these things came to be, the etiology of the history of white people. It's important to understand, because we are going to see how sequential things came to be, and how it also affected us black people. When did we start having class? When did we start having races? Talking about Mongoloids, talking about Caucasoids, talking about Negroids. How did these came to happen? So join me in today's presentation as you're going to dive right into it. Until then, if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Let's dive right into the video.
And that was the distinction between biology and culture. Before the middle of the 20th century, educated people often put the two together, as if your biology dictated your culture. Biology was seen as more permanent than culture. Biology was seen as permanent and dictating your culture. But in the mid-20th century, the school of Franz Boas helped us to see the distinction between biology, which is your body, and your culture, which is your language, what you eat, how you dance, how you talk, all those things that really can change not only from one generation to another, but even within your own lifetime. So Franz Boas, 1858 to 1942, is the key figure here, and I'm going to come back to him in a moment. So my book, The History of White People, includes the 1960s and the 1970s, when American whiteness solidified as one big, undifferentiated race. As the immortal words of Malcolm X, the white man, instead of various white races. If you have your book on hand, chapter 27, Black Nationalism and White Ethnics, talks about the response of white ethnics to Malcolm X and to Black Power. The response was, I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm not white, I'm Irish. Or maybe I am white, but mostly I'm Greek. And these became, they thought of themselves as the unmeltable ethnics. People who were focusing not so much on their white identity, but especially on their ethnic identity. I'm Italian, I'm Jewish, I'm Irish, gave rise after the 1970s of a phenomenon called heritage tourism. And here's an ad for Italian heritage tourism. It's quite taken for granted now that people go to Italy or go to Israel to find their roots or who they really are, heritage tourism. So the first thing that the history of white people teaches us about race in general is that race is not a biological fact, even though race is supposed to be biological. Race is supposed to be permanent. Race is supposed to be innate. But its definitions change over time and place because race is an ideology that claims to be biological. And it's within that ideology that race's biological claims are vast. But in our time of heritage tourism, we also see a melding of culture and biology. And this comes up in our times since the investigation of the human genome and its commercialization as 23andMe or Ancestry.com or African Ancestors, of companies that will let you swab your cheek and then tell you who you really are. Who you really are in terms of your DNA, which means biologically. So it's as if that turn that Boas gave us in the 20th century, it's as if Boas got swept aside, that we no longer had a distinction between culture and biology, that now we have DNA, which will tell you who you are. So today, many Americans, and people in other places as well, believe that biology is destiny. It's no longer a struggle between nature and nurture, it's nature that tells you who you are. Hence the appeal of DNA testing businesses. This is from 23andMe. So you can do the cheap one, which will only give you your ancestry, or you can do the better one that will tell you about your health, because supposedly what's going to happen to you in terms of your bodily health is also hidden in your DNA. Now, we might be tempted to think that only white people would do this. Is that true? You're right. You're right. So if you go to Ancestry.com, this is just a piece of the screenshot. They have several people, and one of the figures is an African-American woman named Courtney. So Courtney swabs and sends and pays, and she discovers that she has links to the Akan and the Asante, a matrilineal society of female warriors, led in the late 19th century by Queen Ya Asantewa. This remarkable woman fought colonization in her country and is still revered in Ghana today for her contributions. So Courtney, who is a light-skinned African American, has a warrior queen in her background, and therefore her race is more likely to be warrior queen race. Now, I actually have a master's degree, an old master's degree from the 60s in African history. And as you mentioned, I lived in Ghana, and I studied African history before Courtney and before DNA. What I just read to you from Ancestry.com bears little resemblance to what I learned as African history a long time ago. So the 20th century is not the 21st century, and usable knowledge about identity and racial identity has changed over time. As you learn in The History of White People, the book, things change. Today, the ideology of race, with its stress on the crucial role of genetic ancestry in identity, has given rise to the expansion of ethnic tourism into the African American market. So race in American terms continues, like whiteness, to change with time and circumstances. So let me close by focusing a little bit on the industry growing out of the long-term and erroneous linking of biology to culture. Let's return to Courtney and her DNA results from Ancestry.com that linked her to Ghana's Ya Asantewa. Ya Asantewa, 1840-1921. So Ya Asantewa and 21st century tourism has attracted attention of the scholar Linda R. Day, who wrote a marvelous article called "What's Tourism Got to Do with It? The Ya Asantewa Legacy and the Development in Asanteman." And what Linda Day is doing is pulling together the history of Ghana with the industry of ethnic tourism. And she's generalizing this, but she happens to be talking about Ya Asantewa's anti-colonial war in 1900, to note that there has been new commemorations of Ya Asantewa with the rise of tourism and ethnic tourism. So countries like Italy, which is one of the most visited tourist destinations in the entire world, but increasingly now African countries like Ghana are pulling together a usable past so that now there is a celebration of the centenary of the anti-colonial war led by Ya Asantewa. and there are celebrations to honor her memory. But Linda Day asked questions about the cultural, the construct of cultural authenticity as rooted in heritage tourism, and to see how the presentation of a local history is shaped for the ends of tourism. So to recreate the Ya Asantewaa story, much had to be left out and smoothed over. For instance, why Ya Asantewaa did not win, what kind of support she had from other people in Ashantiland or in what became the Gold Coast. How do you represent those people? How do you represent the traders who told the British about Ya Asantewaa, or that Ya Asantewaa herself held slaves? How do you present all that for tourism? Well, the answer is you don't. And so this is an invitation from the website of Ghana Travel, which invites you to witness our unique culture. So now, in terms of race as Black changing, in terms of DNA testing and of seeking one's biological ancestry, we now have to fold in the capitalistic interest of an industry called tourism. Thank you.
For a wonderful and
There you are.
thought-provoking talk. Can everyone hear me? Great. So what we'd like to do now is we'd like to open the floor for questions. So we have this microphone set up here, and I'm going to put the mic back here and let you use a question, so please feel free to line up if you have questions. Have a couple of rules. So one, please make your question a question. And then also please keep your question brief. And so I will say, since we are in a church in the spirit of the Black church, I will not hesitate to act like a deaconess and touch your shoulder if it gets a little out of hand, okay? So without that, please feel free to come forward.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I'm really surprised to hear that you say that the notion of race was created in the middle of the 19th century. I had understood that what justified slavery was the explorations of the 16th and 15th century, and the hierarchical notions and the notion of inferiority that rationalized slavery and all of that terrible history. So what was the ideology behind all that if it wasn't race?
Money.
Sorry?
Money.
But
Money.
Just there wasn't any. That was it. There wasn't any conceptualization of these group as
Well,
inferior.
the conceptualization, the real elaboration comes in the Enlightenment. In History of White People, I talked to you about sugar. And sugar started in what is now the East Indies, Indonesia, and then came across the Crusaders discovered it in what we now think of as the Holy Land or the Middle East, and then brought the taste to Europe. But at that same time, roughly, was it 1453, when the Ottomans cut off the Eastern Mediterranean from Western Europe. And that kind of put the damper on the trade in sugar. Sugar had been produced in the Eastern Mediterranean by several kinds of farmers. Some of them were free, some of them were slaves, some of them were sharecroppers. A whole medley of ways of producing sugar. But once Constantinople, now Istanbul, was cut off, there needed to be a new source of sugar. At that same time, the Portuguese discovered that they had been sort of edging around, looking out for stuff, how are we going to get our sugar? And they discovered that you could get over to what was a newly discovered Western Hemisphere. And it was really great for sugar. So the sugar industry is the short answer to your question.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your conversation. So one of the other things that's happening with regards to the 23andMe type folks is actually the criminalization of people based off of the cheek swabbing and sometimes the blood testing as well.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
No, I can't.
Okay.
I can say yes. I can say you're absolutely right. But I can't say more than that because I have not done, I read the papers, that's all I know. And I also know that facial recognition software is also being used. And it seems that in our political economy, just about anything you can invent will be used to lock people up.
I'm not too shy. Hi. Keisha Cameron, I have been following your work and you via... Better?
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, I can hear it. My name's Keisha Cameron. I have been following you and your work since I read your book just over a year ago, year and a half ago. And I know you're an artist as well. So I've appreciated the way that you weave stories between those two worlds. And I'm a farmer and a fiber producer. I've started reading, I think it's Sven Beckert's book on the Empire of Cotton.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting that your response to the gentleman's question pointed to sugar.
Yes.
And the sugar, and knowing that that was a large industry, but
Yeah.
cotton being that kind of revolutionized and set the stage for capitalism.
Yeah.
So my first question is, can you talk a little bit more about the cotton industry? And then could you also suggest to this young fiber farmer any resources or point me towards where I could see more black and brown fiber arts? Because there's an absence of
Yeah.
a lot of that history
Yeah.
that's carried forward.
For your second question, on my Facebook page, I'm friends with people who make quilts. But I don't know about fiber artists in the sense of weavers or farmers of color. My West Coast self gets what's called fiber shed, and this is a concept. The fiber shed is like a watershed. The watershed is the water that comes into the basin. So the fiber shed is where the stuff that becomes fiber comes from. So my way into it was through Petaluma, California, where farmers and people who raise sheep engage in farming practices that are good for the earth and that are also good for the fiber. So I can't really be of help, but you might want to track down fiber shed. Now, as for cotton, the traditional places for cotton to come from and to nourish the West, that is Europe and then what became the United States, was India and Egypt. For the United States, cotton didn't become a really big industry until the turn of the 19th century with the cotton gin, which really revolutionized the processing of fiber so that a short staple fiber could be used, could be produced for use and for milling without spending too many hours picking this stuff out. So sugar is, this is like the 15th century. And for the West, cotton is more like the 19th century. Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
I have a question, just to kind of put this in context. Emory has classes for people over 55 called,
Use a microphone.
oh,
Yeah, no, here.
There's one
Yeah,
right
this
here.
microphone. Yeah,
okay.
there you go.
Emory has classes for people over 55 at their North Druid Hills location, and we have many excellent teachers, including the one standing back there, in many classes that have been investigating the whole topic of race as an identity. And just one comment, I was getting ready to tear up my high school diploma and my college diplomas because all the history that I was taught, particularly in Texas, was in the realm of fantasy. But here's my question. I just finished reading Stamped from the Beginning, and I become so intrigued with how race is used, by people in power. And talk about a propaganda, a very, propaganda through the ages. It keeps, in the book White Rage,
Oh, yeah.
it keeps...
That's a really good book.
It keeps morphing, as soon as, the genome study came out and said, we're 99.9% the same, then people morphed off into another reason why race is so important.
Well, this kind of business pays.
Yeah, it pays. My question is, your book was written in 2010, and given the last 3 years or so, let's say, what would you add or change about your book?
Yeah. It just so happens that this fall I will start an artist book with the working title, The History of White People for Dummies, illustrated by the author with comments on American whiteness since Trump. It will be an artist book. And so, for instance, I started you off by saying that there's this really hard part that people cannot hear, that there used to be more, in science, there used to be more than one white race. Over and over again, I read scholars saying how the Irish became white. Somehow, Noel Ignatieff's book is more persuasive than mine, that people really want to be able to read our categories of race backwards. And that's why I started you by saying things change. And so what you're talking about is that racial distinction is like the DNA of the United States as a nation state. And so it's one of the most useful ones along with gender of dividing people up. But how people use those concepts, that changes by time and place and the purpose. What is the purpose? So you're never going to get to, one, what is the scientific definition of race? You're not going to find it because somebody will disagree with you right away. And even if you did find it, it would change. So that simply is not to be. We need to accept that race is a very malleable ideology. Yeah.
Your comments made me think about the eugenics movement in the early part of the 20th century. And my question to you is, our interest in or our use of DNA potentially opening up the door towards the use of that science for classification purposes, similar to race?
Yes, in the sense that somebody is bound to use whatever concept that has a market for it. So in the early part of the 20th century, well, they didn't have DNA testing, but they did have compulsory sterilization. And so that was the policy answer to the idea that some people were genetically, I mean, they didn't use the word genetic, but they were biologically inferior. The term was feeble-minded. And I point out to you that when we think about that kind of policy, we tend to assume that it's mainly being used against black people. This was not the case of the whole feeble-mindedness stuff. Surely black people got caught up in it. But the best-known cases, Buck v. Bell in Virginia in 1925, was a young white woman. And so the people who were sterilized, compulsorily sterilized, were people of all races. So yes, you have to be vigilant, but it's not just DNA. I mean, it's, blue eyes and blonde hair, tall, any kind of human difference that can be, that can be industrialized, basically, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. You mentioned that Blumenbach used both skull measurements and also notions of beauty as our cuteness, as you put it. As
I should have
ways
said
of-
beauty.
as ways of determining the
Yes.
categories.
Yes.
I was hoping you would talk a little bit more about the ways in which standards of beauty or notions of beauty are wrapped up in the way in which we categorize race.
I've got a whole chapter in, oh, bless your heart. I'm going to take you home with me. Called Beauty as a Scientific Concept. Because I noticed when I was doing my research, and I did a lot of research, that over and over again, there'd be measurements and there'd be toting up all these, and there'd be charts and everything. But the cinching argument would be, plus the blush makes white women cuter. And that was like, this really does it. So art historians have actually written about the use of the blush as an identifying concept. I don't talk about the blush. I may mention it, but mostly I was fascinated that, and here I come back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, it was important for Emerson, his book is called English Traits. And it's a very race book, and he has a chapter in it called Race. And his point is that his kind of white people are the best. And he goes on and on and on about Saxons and how beautiful Saxon men are. He takes it back to the Northmen. It's not clear where this Saxony is. It could be in Denmark, it could be Lower Saxony, it could be the Netherlands, but it's not Saxon like in Eastern Germany. It's not Dresden. It's not Leipzig. It's someplace along the English Channel. And these men were so beautiful. That was Emerson. But before that, for Blumenbach, it's the female character who's beautiful. So his skull, his Caucasian skull, is his beautiful Georgian skull. I am going to Georgia finally this September, and I'm going to take some pictures and bring them back to you so you can see if Georgians really are all that beautiful. I once went to an art museum, an art gallery in Chelsea in New York, where an artist from Georgia, it was all of the gallery was about Georgian artists. And there was nobody else there but me. So I said to the gallerista, I said, there's this saying, this idea that Georgians are the most beautiful people in the world. Is that true? She said, yes. And she said, not only that, the term gorgeous comes from Georgians. I'll find out. But At any rate, so this skull was from a woman. And one of the reasons that it took me so long to write the history of white people was I was dealing with sources in German and French as well as in English. And the cover letter with this skull, as it came to Blumenbach, says that this was the skull of a female Georgian who died of venereal disease. She was a sex slave. On that happy note.
Pass up an opportunity with someone, you are a national treasure.
Oh, bless your heart. Thank
Your work
you.
is so significant.
Thank you so much.
And you can see I have your book right here, my Kindle. No.
Okay.
I'm curious because it had seemed as if the Genome Project would lay to rest the issue about race. Yet today we still have white supremacists. What are your thoughts about that?
Just for a moment, yeah. You're absolutely right. And race is very useful. It mobilizes people. It mobilizes, what, 30–40% of American voters. How are you going to resist that as a way of getting your people in office and in power when that is so potent? So we're not going to get away from this real soon. But having said that, the tenor between like 2000, when President Clinton says, you know, race is useless, we're all 99.90 point the same, and then in about 2004 or 5, a pharmaceutical company discovered that you could market blood pressure medicine according to DNA. It's supposed to be better for black people. So, you know, who's a black person? Well, the people whose doctors prescribe this, I suppose. And then DNA was industrialized, and it became a paying industry. So maybe we need some paying industries that undo some of this. But it will get not undone, but it will subside. It will subside because there are so many more non-black Americans now recognizing what you said about, you know, what you were taught in school, or what the commonplaces of the culture tell you about race. There's so many more non-black Americans who are now willing to hear what black Americans have been saying about race for all these, well, getting on for centuries now. So I don't think it will be forever what it's like now. But it's true, now is a tough time.
Hi. This has been, your presentation is awesome. And
Thank you.
It's just stimulating a lot of questions in my mind. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the impact and or fallout of the racial construct relative to its impact on African Americans, people of color, and this idea of assimilation, i.e. families in the early part of the 20th century, or even much later, encouraging their offspring to marry light-colored people so that they can acculturate, assimilate much easier. I was curious you to speak about that.
Colorism is a thing. Colorism is a real thing. I live in a neighborhood in Newark that is largely Latino. And every morning, my dear husband goes down to the little deli and he buys the New York Times and the Star Ledger. So we get a paper from New Jersey and we get a paper from a national paper. And when I look at the images in the state paper and the national paper, I see a multiracial world. When I walk around the Ironbound, I never see a dark-skinned Latina. The culture in the commercial culture in the Ironbound of Newark is a colorist culture. So looking forward, when Latinos are 50% of the population, we'll have all that colorism work to do all over again.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you. You really filled in a gap for me.
Oh, good.
I was concerned with my understanding. When you talked about the 20th century and kind of the mid-20th century and the race classification in the three groups, my mind immediately went to the work that I work on in the human rights and the Human Rights Declaration with the United Nations. That came about at the same time.
It did.
What influence did your research reveal was impacted by that declaration?
The short answer is I don't know. I don't know. But the United Nations came out of that same culture influenced by Boas and the really anti-racist. No, they were not anti-racist. Franz Boas believed that race was a thing. He just didn't believe there should be racial discrimination. So I guess you would kind of call him an anti-racist. You see what I mean? And during the Second World War, he and his students, or rather his students, because he died in 1942, he died with a cigar and a glass of wine at lunch in the Columbia University Faculty Club. Just keeled over. 1942, that's a little early. So at that point, it was anthropologists who were felt to hold the truth about how to classify people. And so they made pamphlets which circulated in which the people who were writing about human rights would have known. So I'm sure that that is the same epistemological world.
So it was an intersection somewhere.
I think so.
Okay.
But I can't tell you
Okay.
for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Naomi King, Martin Luther King's sister-in-law, A.D. King's wife, who was also killed, A.D. King, in
Yes.
a swimming pool.
Yeah.
She spoke here recently, and she's a friend, and she's trying to lead a movement to unite humanitarians, to unite people not based on race, religion, country. $1.3 trillion goes to wars where strangers kill strangers. Do you think it's, I really admire her, and I was wondering if you think that something like this could have a long-term impact for future generations?
For future generations, only if it is incorporated, made into something like a United Nations and has millions of people with it. But my sense is that if this is a local, is it local, national, international?
Well, she would like to take it internationally. They've gone to schools and done it, like in public schools.
Right. Yeah, I think that each one of these efforts makes a difference. A long, long time ago, I was an assistant professor. And I taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and I taught for the first and last time African American history. And by the time we got through the year, the students said, oh, all these horrible things happen. What's the use? And I said, well, think of what they would have happened if there hadn't been all this pushback. And I thought of a metaphor for change, and that is like the sand dunes. Sand dunes are made of grains of sand, but they make islands, they make continents. So every effort makes a difference. As a historian, I see very, very little that lasts 2 centuries. You know, people have sometimes asked me, how will people read my books in 100 years? And I say, people will not be reading my books in 100 years. Books don't last that long. So most things don't last that long, but they can be really important at the time and in the place.
I did want to mention one other thing. When I was a medical student at the hospital, Grady Hospital downtown,
yes.
They weren't taking blood pressures, and blacks in particular have more strokes, heart attacks, and kidney disease. And the professor there suggested that I, as a medical student, do a study on that. And his father was Albert Tuttle, Sr., who desegregated the South, the federal court judge.
Oh.
And we did that study and then got a big grant, and then with Morehouse Medical School went to Africa, and there were about 1,000 of us who started the International Society on Hypertension in Blacks. And it's, I think, had some major, hopefully some major impact.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Painter. I'm also a historian here at Emory, and I use your work in my classes. It's so effective, so it's just really an honor to see you here on our campus. One of the questions I have based on your talk is, what are some of the global processes through which whiteness was consolidated in the mid to late 20th century? And if you have time for a second question, can you talk a little bit about your writing life and how you remain so prolific?
Okay. I wouldn't say that whiteness was consolidated in the 20th century. I would say that various institutions were consolidated. Let's see. As you were talking, I was thinking about imperialism. Political imperialism kind of shrank in the late 20th century. I see from the Times that there are new kinds of imperialisms every day based on debt and development. So whiteness is too big a thing to work kind of in lockstep. And it tends to be an explanation sometimes in regimes like apartheid, it can be a cause, but usually it's an explanation for something, and that explanation may or may not carry into another place. So I would say look for the details rather than the big concept. Was there another part of your question that I missed? Oh, writing. Let's see, the last book I wrote was Old in Art School, which took about 3-4 years. Is that right? 3-4 years? And it was really hard to start because it's a different kind of writing. And it's a very honest book, and I didn't know I could be that honest in writing and telling you what's in my heart. And I knew that I would have to talk about what a pathetic little person I had become in art graduate school. I didn't know that I could talk to you about how my mother's death made me feel that my time was very limited without my realizing that it was her death that was making me feel that way and make a mistake in applying to graduate school when I did. It was a bad decision. So I wrote a chapter called A Bad Decision. I didn't know I could do that. So it took some time, and it took like 4 or 5 drafts to get to the book. And I could not have done it without 2 artist residencies that took me away from home, because when you're at home, everything needs to be done. So I did an artist residency at UCross Foundation in Wyoming and a residency at MacDowell in New Hampshire. And I hope to go back to MacDowell in the fall to start work on the history of white people for dummies. Can't do it when I stay home. It's just, plus, I now realize that I have a new vocation, which is author of creative nonfiction, which is a full-time job. Just editing and promoting and traveling, plus the history of white people came out in French at the end of January. And so I was in France in February and in March and in Norway in February to talk about those books. And I can't just bound off the plane and start whatever needs to be done. So this is a long way of saying I probably am not going to write anymore until my next artist residency. Yeah, which I recommend to all of you who are writers or scholars, leave home.
Hello.
Hi.
Just a short question, which is that I think a lot about what Dr. John Powell says when he talks about the need to transform the meaning of whiteness, and I'm curious if you had any thoughts on what that might look like, or what that could look like.
I actually wrote another op-ed in the New York Times about that in 1915. If you just either go to my website has 3 parts. One part is No Painter Historian. The middle part is Olden Art School, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Didn't get it, but it was a finalist. And the other part is Artist. So look under the history part, and or just search on the New York Times homepage. And it came out about the time of Rachel Dolezal. So they asked me to write kind of about Rachel Dolezal. My sense was, poor Rachel Dolezal, her mother outed her? Her mother? That is a family drama, if you ask me. And I feel about blackness like I feel about gay marriage. That if gay people marry, it takes nothing away from my heterosexual marriage. And if Rachel Dolezal wants to be black and is doing anti-racist work, it takes nothing away from my blackness. So I was going to write that. But then that Nazi killed 15 people who invited him into their church for a prayer service. So that gave it another spin. So I said, white people need another identity. So this is before Trump gave them identity. And I said, there is actually a word that people could use if they're engaged in anti-racist work, and that is abolitionists. We have a history of anti-racist white people, and anti-racist white people should use that history and use the word abolitionist. Okay, thank you so much.
One important thing that she talks about is that the weighing of, culture and biology when it comes to addressing the issue of, races and things to do with white race. So she shows to interplay, that is race and biology, because she says that biology played an important role in making somebody know their race, right? So it is not like both before they were used, like she describes that both before they were used as one and the same thing, but learners, people who are learning, educated people say to come and say to it like, no, there's a distinction, right? We have the culture and we have the biology. So the biology determines which tribe you came from. The biology determines which culture you came from, So I had some groups that she also talks about, So different ethnic groups, like for example, the Celts and different ethnic groups, The Celts were a group of tribal societies in an Iron Age and medieval Europe who spoke Celt language. They were not a race in the modern sense, and I think she talks about this, but an ethnic group with shared culture and language. So today, the Celtic heritage is most strongly associated with regions like Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. So those are amongst other things that she talks about. And I'm getting to look at the Germanic tribes also. Another significant ethnic group in European history includes the Germanic tribes who lived in parts what are now known as Germany, Denmark, and Scandinavian. These tribes played a crucial role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the formation of medieval, European kingdoms, amongst other things that, she talks about. Now, you'll ask yourself, where did the history of whiteness and class came from? So look, the historical racial classifications, as we know, the Caucasoids, today we call them the Caucasians. Now, the term Caucasoid refers to people from Europe, North Africa. As I said, I was surprised to hear that they also came from North Africa. But now I understand human beings, life started in Africa, right? So human beings came from Africa. So I'm not surprised seeing North Africa and other parts of, West Asia. Now, this term was based on the idea that these groups shared certain physical traits, such as lighter skin, a narrow nose, and a certain skull shape. And these are what we refer to, the sharp nose that always white people have. And this is not being stereotypical or discriminative, but I'm trying to talk about how, things look like, how they really look like, right? So, and it's not a problem that they look like that, because the places that they came, the biology played an important role to just determine or just to show where they came from. I'm also going to talk about, so was trying to describe themselves, like the term Caucasian itself comes from the Caucasus region, from the Caucasus Mountains. It was arbitrarily chosen by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, an 18th century German scientist who mistakenly believed that the region was the origin of the white race. So we say that mistakenly believed that their region was the origin of the white race. Now, so over time, Caucasians became synonymous with white, though it originally encompasses a broader range of people, including those from Middle East and North Africa. So when we say Caucasians, people refer to as white people. Rather, the real meaning of Caucasian is describing people who come from Europe, North Africa, and some parts of West Asia. And I think that's something new that I've also learned. And definitely it's important that I've known that. So we are also going to see Mongoloids, right? We are going to see Mongoloids according to those times. What are the stratification? Who are these Mongoloid people? Now listen, the term Mongoloid was used to classify people from East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Arctic, and Native Americans. It was based on physical traits such as epicatonic eye fields, and certain skull shapes. So the Mongoloids, just like the Caucasoids, the Mongoloid is an outdated classification. It is based on superficial physical differences and ignored the vast cultural, linguistic, and genetic diversity within the population it attempts to classify. Amongst other important things that I believe that we need to, talk about. So here comes the Negroids. Now, where did the Negroids come from? Where did the term Negroid came from? Somebody will ask themselves this question. And I think I'm just going to reinforce what the professor said. Now, the word Negroid was a term used to describe people from sub-Saharan Africa. It was associated with certain physical traits like darker skin, broader nose, and certain hair textures. This classification is based on, generally the Negroids, the black people, because the long trans-Saharan slave trade came, and we have some black people who also found themselves in Africa. And also we have the two groups of black people who came as slaves and black people who just traveled from Africa to the United States, and they're the natives of the United States. So they all have the same physical features, and we call them as Negro. They have darker skin, they have the broader nose, and certain hair textures, right? Because we have different hair texture, with different from Asians, different from different from other races, just to know. Now here I'm going to describe the history of whiteness and class. Where did now the history of whiteness with class came from? These are questions that I'm just going to be talking about. So the origins of whiteness. The concept of whiteness as a racial identity developed primarily in the context of European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans began to categorize themselves as white, in contrast to the African and indigenous people they encountered and enslaved. When they identified themselves as white, they started the division, the class division. The class division, for example, poor versus rich white people. So throughout the history, there have been a significant class difference amongst white people. In the medieval Europe, for example, the majority of population were poor peasants who worked in the land under feudal lords. During the Industrial Revolution, class divisions became even more pronounced, with small, wealthy elite controlling factories and industries, while majority of white workers lived in poverty. Majority of white workers lived in poverty, So now this is where the stratification started, right? This is where the class started, and it was dominantly led by the Industrial Revolution. Now, the origins, what are the origins of modern white populations? The origins of modern white population. And why am I saying that this is important? This is important because we get to see how things really, came into play, and it's just important for us to get to learn, get to see from the lenses of the professor who shared these inevitable information, who shared these important information. So the origin of modern white populations. Now, this is according to what the professor said, alongside with some research that I did, which is important. Now, migration and mixing played a big part in the origin of modern populations that we are seeing today. Modern white population that we are seeing today. Now, people we consider white today have a complex history of migration and mixing. The ancestors of modern Europeans likely migrated from regions in Near East and Central Asia, gradually spreading across Europe over thousands of years. This population mixed with indigenous hunters and gatherers and other groups, creating a diverse array of European ethnicities we see today. Now, migration and mixing really played an important role. people from different parts came. People migrated, and everything which happened. People migrated, people met, people intermingled, and we have the different arrays of white people that we see today. Also, we need to look at the modern genetic understanding. Now, after mixing, it is not all about the culture. This is why the professor was explaining about biology and culture, because biology and culture are both seen as the same thing, right? But we started looking at them distinctly, because it's important looking at them distinctly. Now, modern genetics has shown that human population are not as distinct as these old racial categories suggested. Genetic diversity is greater within the so-called racial groups than between them, and all are human beings. We share common ancestries that goes back to Africa. And as I said, life really began in Africa. Now, I didn't have much to say about this video because for me, it was a learning session, and I learned, and I hope that you have also learned. Now, this is a presenter, Eugene Talk Stories, and if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.